Section 59 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1, by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 59. Observations on Etats de Unis, prepared for the Encyclopedie Methodique, Part 2. Mr. Jefferson presents his compliments to Monsieur de Maisonneuve and sends him copies of the 13th, 23rd, and 24th articles of the treaty between the King of Prussia and the United States. If Monsieur de Maisonneuve proposes to mention the facts of cruelty, of which he and Mr. Jefferson spoke yesterday, the 24th article will introduce them properly, because they produced a sense of the necessity of that article. These facts are: 1. The death of upwards of 11,000 American prisoners in one prison ship, the Jersey, and in the space of 3 years. 2. General Howe's permitting our prisoners, taken at the Battle of Germantown and placed under a guard, in the yard of the State House of Philadelphia, to be so long without any food furnished them that many perished in hunger. Where the bodies laid, it was seen that they had eaten all the grass around them, within their reach, after they had lost the power of rising or moving from their place. 3. The second fact was the act of a commanding officer, the first of several commanding officers, and for so long a time as must suppose the approbation of government. But the following was the act of government itself. During the periods that our affairs seemed unfavorable and theirs successful, that is to say, after the evacuation of New York, and again after the taking of Charleston in South Carolina, they regularly sent our prisoners, taken on the seas and carried to England, to the East Indies. This is so certain that in the month of November or December 1785, Mr. Adams, having officially demanded a delivery of the American prisoners sent to the East Indies, Lord Carmarthen answered officially, quote, that orders were immediately issued for their discharge, unquote. Monsieur de Maisonneuve is at liberty to quote this fact. 4. A fact to be ascribed not only to the government, but to the Parliament, who passed an act for that purpose, in the beginning of the war, was the obliging our prisoners, taken at sea, to join them and fight against their countrymen. This they effected by starving and whipping them. The insult on Captain Stanhope, which happened at Boston last year, was a consequence of this. 2 persons, Dunbar and Lothrop, whom Stanhope had treated in this manner, having particularly inflicted 24 lashes on Dunbar, meeting him at Boston, attempted to beat him. But the people interposed and saved him. The fact is referred to in that paragraph of the Declaration of Independence which says, quote, he has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands, unquote. This was the most afflicting to our prisoners of all the cruelties exercised on them. The others affected the body only, but this, the mind. They were haunted by the horror of having perhaps themselves shot the ball by which a father or a brother fell. Some of them had constancy enough to hold out against half allowance of food and repeated whippings. These were generally sent to England, and from thence to the East Indies. One of them escaped from the East Indies and got back to Paris, where he gave an account of his sufferings to Mr. Adams, who happened to be then at Paris. Monsieur de Maisonneuve, where he mentions that the slave law has been passed in Virginia without the clause of emancipation, is pleased to mention that neither Mr. Wythe nor Mr. Jefferson was present to make the proposition they had meditated, from which people who do not give themselves the trouble to reflect or inquire might conclude hastily that their absence was the cause why the proposition was not made, and of course that there were not in the assembly persons of virtue and firmness enough to propose the clause for emancipation. This supposition would not be true, There were persons there who wanted neither the virtue to propose nor talents to enforce the proposition, had they seen that the disposition of the legislature was ripe for it. These worthy characters would feel themselves wounded, degraded, and discouraged by this idea. Mr. Jefferson would therefore be obliged to Monsieur de Mesnier to mention it in some such manner as this, quote, "Of the two commissioners who had concerted the amendatory clause for the gradual emancipation of slaves, Mr. Wythe could not be present, he being a member of the Judiciary Department, and Mr. Jefferson was absent on the legation to France. But there were not wanting in that assembly men of virtue enough to propose, and talents to vindicate this clause. But they saw that the moment of doing it with success was not yet arrived, and that an unsuccessful effort, as too often happens, would only rivet still closer the chains of bondage, and retard the moment of delivery to this oppressed description of men. What a stupendous, what an incomprehensible machine is man, who can endure toil, famine, stripes, imprisonment, and death itself, in vindication of his own liberty, and the next moment be deaf to all those motives whose power supported him through his trial, and inflict on his fellow-men a bondage 1 hour of which is fraught with more misery than ages of that which he rose in rebellion to oppose. But we must await with patience the workings of an overruling providence, and hope that that is preparing the deliverance of these our suffering brethren. When the measure of their tears shall be full, when their groans shall have involved heaven itself in darkness, doubtless a God of justice will awaken to their distress, and by diffusing light and liberality among their oppressors, or at length by his exterminating thunder, manifest his attention to the things of this world, and that they are not left to the guidance of a blind fatality." Unquote. The following are articles of the treaty with Prussia, referred to in the preceding observations. Article 13. And in the same case, of one of the contracting parties being engaged in war with any other power, to prevent all the difficulties and misunderstandings that usually arise respecting the merchandise heretofore called contraband, such as arms, ammunition, and military stores of every kind, no such articles carried in the vessels or by the subjects or citizens of one of the contracting parties to the enemies of the other shall be deemed contraband, so as to induce confiscation or condemnation and a loss of property to individuals. Nevertheless, it shall be lawful to stop such vessels and articles, and to detain them for such length of time as the captors may think necessary to prevent the inconvenience or damage that might ensue from their proceeding, paying, however, a reasonable compensation for the loss such arrests shall occasion to the proprietors, and it shall further be allowed to use, in the service of the captors, the whole or any part of the military stores so detained, paying the owners the full value of the same, to be ascertained by the current price at the place of its destination. But in the case supposed of a vessel stopped for articles heretofore deemed contraband, if the master of the vessel stopped will deliver out the goods supposed to be of contraband nature, he shall be admitted to do it, and the vessel shall not, in that case, be carried into any port, nor further detained, but shall be allowed to proceed on her voyage. Article 23. If war should arise between the two contracting parties, the merchants of either country then residing in the other shall be allowed to remain 9 months to collect their debts and settle their affairs, and may depart freely, carrying off all their effects without molestation or hindrance. And all women and children, scholars of every faculty, cultivators of the earth, artisans, manufacturers, and fishermen, unarmed and inhabiting unfortified towns, villages, or places, and, in general, all others whose occupations are for the common subsistence and benefit of mankind, shall be allowed to continue their respective employments, and shall not be molested in their persons, nor shall their houses be burned or otherwise destroyed, nor their fields wasted by the armed force of the enemy, into whose power, by the events of war, they may happen to fall. But if anything is necessary to be taken from them for the use of such armed force, the same shall be paid for at a reasonable price. And all merchant and trading vessels employed in exchanging the products of different places, and thereby rendering the necessaries, conveniences, and comforts of human life more easy to be obtained, and more general, shall be allowed to pass free and unmolested. And neither of the contracting parties shall grant or issue any commission to any private armed vessels, empowering them to take or destroy such trading vessels, or interrupt such commerce. Article 24. And to prevent the destruction of prisoners of war by sending them into distant and inclement countries, or by crowding them into close and noxious places, the two contracting parties solemnly pledge themselves to each other and the world that they will not adopt any such practice, that neither will send the prisoners whom they may take from the other into the East Indies or any other parts of Asia or Africa, but that they shall be placed in some part of their dominions in Europe or America in wholesome situations, that they shall not be confined in dungeons, prison ships, nor prisons, nor be put into irons, nor bound, nor otherwise restrained in the use of their limbs, that the officers shall be enlarged on their paroles within convenient districts, and have comfortable quarters, and the common men be disposed in cantonments, open and extensive enough for air and exercise, and lodged in barracks as roomy and good as are provided by the party in whose power they are, for their own troops, that the officers shall be daily furnished by the party in whose power they are, with as many rations and of the same articles and quality as are allowed by them, either in kind or by commutation, to officers of equal rank in their own army, and all others shall be daily furnished by them with such rations as they allow to a common soldier in their own service, the value whereof shall be paid by the other party on a mutual adjustment of accounts for the subsistence of prisoners at the close of the war. And the said accounts shall not be mingled with, nor set off against any others, nor the balances due on them be withheld as a satisfaction or reprisal for any other article, or for any other cause, real or pretended, whatever. That each party shall be allowed to keep a commissary of prisoners of their own appointment with every separate cantonment of prisoners in the possession of the other, which commissary shall see the prisoners as often as he pleases, shall be allowed to receive and distribute whatever comforts may be sent to them by their friends, and shall be free to make his reports in open letters to those who employ him. But if any officer shall break his parole, or any other prisoner shall escape from the limits of his cantonment after they shall have been designated to him, such individual officer or other prisoner shall forfeit so much of the benefit of this article as provides for his enlargement on parole or cantonment. And it is declared that neither the pretense that war dissolves all treaties, nor any other whatever, shall be considered as annulling or suspending this, or the next preceding article, but on the contrary, that the state of war is precisely that for which they are provided, and during which they are to be as sacredly observed as the most acknowledged articles in the law of nature and nations. End of section 59. Section 60 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1 by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 152 to Mr. Rittenhouse, Paris, January 25, 1786. Dear Sir, your favor of September the 28th came to hand a few days ago. I thank you for the details on the subject of the southern and western lines. There remains thereon one article, however, which I will still beg you to inform me of, viz., how far is the western boundary beyond the meridian of Pittsburgh? This information is necessary to enable me to trace that boundary in my map. I shall be much gratified also with a communication of your observations on the curiosities of the western country. It will not be difficult to induce me to give up the theory of the growth of shells without their being the nidus of animals. It is only an idea, not an opinion with me. In the notes with which I troubled you, I had observed that there were 3 opinions as to the origins of these shells. 1, that they had been deposited even in the highest mountains by a universal deluge. 2, that they, with all the calcareous stones and earths, are animal remains. 3, that they grow or shoot as crystals do. I find that I could swallow the last opinion sooner than either of the others, but I have not yet swallowed it. Another opinion might have been added, that some throw of nature has forced up parts which had been the bed of the ocean. But have we any better proof of such an effort of nature than of her shooting a lapetific juice onto the form of a shell? No such convulsion has taken place in our time, nor within the annals of history, nor is the distance greater between the shooting of a lapidific juice onto the form of a crystal or a diamond, which we see, and into the form of a shell, which we do not see, than between the forcing volcanic matter a little above the surface, where it is in fusion, which we see, and the forcing the bed of the sea 15,000 feet above the ordinary surface of the earth, which we do not see. It is not possible to believe any of these hypotheses, and if we lean towards any of them, it should be only till some other is produced, more analogous to the known operations of nature. In a letter to Mr. Hopkinson, I mentioned to him that the Abbé Rochon, who discovered the double refracting power in some of the natural crystals, had lately made a telescope with the metal called platina, which, while it is as susceptible of as perfect a polish as the metal heretofore used for the specula of telescopes, is insusceptible of rust as gold and silver are. There is a person here who has hit on a new method of engraving. He gives you an ink of his composition. Write on copper plates anything of which you would wish to take several copies, and in an hour the plate will be ready to strike them off. So of plans, engravings, etc. This art will be amusing to individuals, if he should make it known. I send you herewith the nautical almanacs for 1786, 1787, 1788, 1789, 1790, which are as late as they are published. You ask how you may reimburse the expense of these trifles? I answer by accepting them, as the procuring you a gratification is the higher one to me than money. We have had nothing curious published lately. I do not know whether you are fond of chemical reading. There are some things in this science worth reading. I will send them to you if you wish it. My daughter is well and joins me in respects to Mrs. Rittenhouse and the young ladies. After asking when we are to have the luminarium, I will close with assurances of the sincere regard and esteem with which I am, dear sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 153, to A. Stewart, Esquire, Paris, January 25, 1786. Dear Sir, I have received your favor of the 17th of October, which, though you mention it as the 3rd you have written me, is the first that has come to hand. I sincerely thank you for the communications it contains. Nothing is so grateful to me at this distance as details, both great and small, of what is passing in my own country. Of the latter, we receive little here, because they either escape my correspondence or are thought unworthy of notice. This, however, is a very mistaken opinion, as everyone may observe by recollecting that when he has been long absent from his neighborhood, the small news of that is the most pleasing, and occupies his first attention, either when he meets with a person from thence, or returns thither himself. I still hope, therefore, that the letter in which you have been so good as to give me the minute occurrences in the neighborhood of Monticello may yet come to hand, and I venture to rely on the many proofs of friendship I have received from you for a continuance of your favors. This will be the more meritorious, as I have nothing to give you in exchange. The quiet of Europe at this moment furnishes little which can attract your notice, nor will that quiet be soon disturbed, at least for the current year. Perhaps it hangs on the life of the King of Prussia, and that hangs by a very slender thread. American reputation in Europe is not such as to be flattering to its citizens. Two circumstances are particularly objected to us: the non-payment of our debts, and the want of energy in our government. These discourage a connection with us. I own it to be my opinion that good will arise from the destruction of our credit. I see nothing else which can restrain our disposition to luxury, and to the change of those manners which alone can preserve republican government. As it is impossible to prevent credit, the best way would be to cure its ill effects by giving an instantaneous recovery to the creditor. This would be reducing purchases on credit to purchases for ready money. A man would then see a prison painted on everything he wished, but had not ready money to pay for. I fear, from an expression in your letter, that the people of Kentucky think of separating not only from Virginia, in which they are right, but also from the Confederacy. I own I should think this a most calamitous event, and such a one as every good citizen should set himself against. Our present federal limits are not too large for good government, nor will the increase of votes in Congress produce any ill effect. On the contrary, it will drown the little divisions at present existing there. Our Confederacy must be viewed as the nest from which all America, North and South, is to be peopled. We should take care, too, not to think it for the interest of that great continent to press too soon on the Spaniards. Those countries cannot be in better hands. My fear is that they are too feeble to hold them till our population can be sufficiently advanced to gain it from them piece by piece. The navigation of the Mississippi we must have. This is all we are as yet ready to receive. I have made acquaintance with a very sensible, candid gentleman here, who was in South America during the revolt which took place there, while our revolution was going on. He says that those disturbances, of which we scarcely heard anything, cost on both sides 100,000 lives. I have made a particular acquaintance here with Monsieur de Buffon, and have a great desire to give him the best idea I can of our elk. Perhaps your situation may enable you to aid me in this. You could not oblige me more than by sending me the horns, skeleton, and skin of an elk, were it possible to procure them. The most desirable form of receiving them would be to have the skin slit from the under jaw along the belly to the tail, and down the thighs to the knee, to take the animal out, leaving the legs and hoofs, the bones of the head, and the horns attached to the skin. By sewing up the belly, etc., and stuffing the skin, it would present the form of the animal. However, as an opportunity of doing this is scarcely to be expected, I shall be glad to receive them detached, packed in a box, and sent to Richmond, to the care of Dr. Curie. Everything of this kind is precious here, and to prevent my adding to your trouble, I must close this letter with assurances of the esteem and attachment with which I am, dear sir, your friend and servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 154, to the Commissioners of the Treasury, Paris, January 26, 1786. Gentlemen, I have been duly honored by the receipt of your letter of December the 6th, and am to thank you for the communications it contained on the state of our funds and expectations here. Your idea that these communications occasionally may be useful to the United States is certainly just, as I am frequently obliged to explain our prospects of paying interest, etc., which I should better do with fuller information. If you would be so good as to instruct Mr. Grand always to furnish me with a duplicate of those cash accounts which he furnishes to you from time to time, and if you would be so good as to direct your secretary to send me copies of such letters as you transmit to Mr. Grand, advising him of the remittances he may expect from time to time, I should thereby be always informed of the sum of money on hand here and the probable expectations of supply. Dr. Franklin, during his residence here, having been authorized to borrow large sums of money, the disposal of that money seemed naturally to rest with him. It was Mr. Grand's practice, therefore, never to pay money but on his warrant. On his departure, Mr. Grand sent all money drafts to me to authorize their payment. I informed him that this was in no wise within my province, as I was unqualified to direct him in it, and that were I to presume to meddle, it would be no additional sanction to him. He refused, however, to pay a shilling without my order. I have been obliged, therefore, to a nugatory interference, merely to prevent the affairs of the United States from standing still. I need not represent to you the impropriety of my continuing to direct Mr. Grand longer than till we can receive your orders, the mischief which might ensue from the uncertainty in which this would place you, as to the extent to which you might venture to draw on your funds here, and the little necessity there is for my interference. Whenever you order a sum of money into Mr. Grand's hands, nothing will be more natural than your instructing him how to apply it, so as that he shall observe your instructions alone. Among these you would doubtless judge it necessary to give him one standing instruction to answer my drafts for such sums as my office authorizes me to call for. These would be salary, couriers, postage, and such other articles as circumstances will require, which cannot be previously defined. These will never be so considerable as to endanger the honor of your drafts. I shall certainly exercise in them the greatest caution and stand responsible to Congress. Mr. Grant conceives that he has suffered in your opinion by an application of 200,000 livres during the last year, differently from what the Office of Finance had instructed him. This was a consequence of his being thought subject to direction here, and it is but justice to relieve him from blame on that account, and to show that it ought to fall, if anywhere, on Dr. Franklin, Mr. Adams, and myself. The case was thus. The moneys here were exhausted. Mr. Grand was in advance about 50,000 livres, and the diplomatic establishments in France, Spain, and Holland, subsisting on his bounties, which they were subject to see stopped every moment, and feared a protest on every bill. Other current expenses, too, were depending on advances from him, and though these were small in their amount, they sometimes involved great consequences. In this situation he received 400,000 livres, to be paid to this government for 1 year's interest. We thought the honor of the United States would suffer less by suspending half the payment to this government, replacing Mr. Grand's advances, and providing a fund for current expenses. We advised him to do so. I still think it was for the best, and I believe my colleagues have continued to see the matter in the same point of view. We may have been biased by feelings excited by our own distressing situation, but certainly as to Mr. Grand, no blame belongs to him. We explained this matter in a letter to Congress at the time, and justice requires this explanation to you, as I conjecture that the former one has not come to your knowledge. The 200,000 livres retained, as before mentioned, have been applied to the purposes described, to the payment of a year's interest to the French officers, which is about 42,000 livres, and other current expenses which doubtless Mr. Grant has explained to you. About a week ago there remained in his hands but about 12,000 livres. In this situation, the demands of the French officers for a second year's interest were presented. But Mr. Grant observed there were neither money nor orders for them. The payment of these gentlemen, the last year, had the happiest effect imaginable. It procured so many advocates for the credit and honor of the United States who were heard in all companies. It corrected the idea that we were unwilling to pay our debts. I fear that our present failure towards them will give new birth to new imputations and a relapse of credit. Under this fear, I have written to Mr. Adams to know whether he can have this money supplied from the funds in Holland, though I have little hope from that quarter, because he had before informed me that those funds would be exhausted by the spring of the present year, and I doubt, too, whether he would venture to order these payments without authority from you. I have thought it my duty to state these matters to you. I have had the honor of enclosing to Mr. J. Commodore Jones's receipts for 181,039 livres, 1 sol and 10 deniers, prize money, which, after deducting his own proportion, he is to remit to you for the officers and soldiers who were under his command. I take the liberty of suggesting whether the expense and risk of double remittances might not be saved by ordering it into the hands of Mr. Grant immediately for the purposes of the Treasury in Europe, while you could make provision at home for the officers and soldiers, whose demands will come in so slowly as to leave you the use of a great proportion of this money for a considerable time, and some of it forever. We could then immediately quiet the French officers. I have the honor to be, with the most perfect respect and esteem, Gentlemen, your most obedient and most humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 155. To Messrs. Buchanan and Hay, Paris, January 26, 1786. Gentlemen, I had the honor of writing to you on the receipt of your orders to procure drafts for the public buildings, and again on the 13th of August. In the execution of these orders, 2 methods of proceeding presented themselves to my mind. The one was to leave to some architect to draw an external according to his fancy, in which way experience shows that about once in 1,000 times a pleasing form is hit upon. The other was to take some model already devised and approved by the general suffrage of the world. I had no hesitation in deciding that the latter was best, nor after the decision was there any doubt what model to take. There is at Nimes, in the south of France, a building called the Maison Quérée, erected in the time of the Caesars, and which is allowed without contradiction to be the most perfect and precious remain of antiquity in existence. Its superiority over anything at Rome, in Greece, at Baalbec or Palmyra, is allowed on all hands, and this single object has placed Nimes in the general tour of travelers. Having not yet had leisure to visit it, I could only judge of it from drawings, and from the relation of numbers who had been to see it. I determined, therefore, to adopt this model, and to have all its proportions justly observed. As it is impossible for a foreign artist to know what number and sizes of apartments would suit the different corps of our government, nor how they should be connected with one another, I undertook to form that arrangement, and this being done, I committed them to an architect, Monsieur Clarison, who had studied this art 20 years in Rome, who had particularly studied and measured the Maison Quérée of Nimes, and had published a book containing most excellent plans, descriptions, and observations on it. He was too well acquainted with the merit of that building to find himself restrained by my injunctions not to depart from his model. In one instance only he persuaded me to admit of this. That was to make the portico 2 columns deep only, instead of 3, as the original is. His reason was that this latter depth would too much darken the apartments. Economy might be added as a second reason. I consented to it to satisfy him, and the plans are so drawn. I knew that it would still be easy to execute the building with a depth of 3 columns, and it is what I would certainly recommend. We know that the Maison Quérée has pleased universally for near 2,000 years. By leaving out a column, the proportions will be changed, and perhaps the effect may be injured more than is expected. What is good is often spoiled by trying to make it better. The present is the first opportunity which has occurred of sending the plans. You will accordingly receive herewith the ground plan, the elevation of the front, and the elevation of the side. The architect, having been much busied, and knowing that this was all which would be necessary in the beginning, has not yet finished the sections of the building. They must go by some future occasion, as well as the models of the front and side, which are making in plaster of Paris. These were absolutely necessary for the guide of workmen, not very expert in their art. It will add considerably to the expense, and I would not have incurred it but that I was sensible of its necessity. The price of the model will be 15 guineas. I shall know in a few days the cost of the drawings, which probably will be the triple of the model. However, this is but conjecture. I will make it as small as possible, pay it, and render you an account in my next letter. You will find on examination that the body of this building covers an area but 2/5 of that which is proposed and begun. Of course, it will take but about 1/2 the bricks, and of course this circumstance will enlist all the workmen and people of the art against the plan. Again, the building begun is to have 4 porticos, this but 1. It is true that this will be deeper than those were probably proposed, but even if it be made 3 columns deep, it will not take half the number of columns. The beauty of this is ensured by experience, and by the suffrage of the whole world. The beauty of that is problematical, as is every drawing, however well it looks on paper, till it be actually executed. And though I suppose there is more room in the plan begun than in that now sent, yet there is enough in this for all 3 branches of government, and more than enough is not wanted. This contains 16 rooms, to wit, 4 on the first floor for the general court, delegates, lobby, and conference, 8 on the second floor for the executive, the senate, and 6 rooms for committees and juries. And over 4 of these smaller rooms of the second floor are 4 mezzaninos or entresols, serving as offices for the clerks of the executive, the senate, the delegates, and the court in actual session. It will be an objection that the work is begun on the other plan, but the whole of this need not be taken to pieces, and of what shall be taken to pieces, the bricks will do for inner work. Mortar never becomes so hard and adhesive to the bricks in a few months, but that it may be easily chipped off. And upon the whole, the plan now sent will save a great proportion of the expense. Hitherto I have spoken of the capital only. The plans for the prison also accompany this. They will explain themselves. I send also the plan of the prison proposed at Lyons, which was sent me by the architect, and to which we are indebted for the fundamental idea of ours. You will see that of a great thing a very small one is made. Perhaps you may find it convenient to build at first only 2 sides, forming an L, but of this you are the best judges. It has been suggested to me that fine gravel mixed in the mortar prevents the prisoners from cutting themselves out, as that would destroy their tools. In my letter of August the 13th, I mentioned that I could send workmen from hence. As I am in hopes of receiving your orders precisely in answer to that letter, I shall defer actually engaging any till I receive them. In like manner, I shall defer having plans drawn for a governor's house, etc., till further orders, only assuring you that the receiving and executing these orders will always give me a very great pleasure, and the more should I find that what I have done meets your approbation. I have the honor to be, with sentiments of the most perfect esteem, Gentlemen, your most obedient and most humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. End of section 60. Section 61 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1 by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 156 to John Adams, Paris, February 7th, 1786. Dear Sir, I'm honored with yours of January the 19th. Mine of January the 12th had not, I suppose, at that time got to your hands, as the receipt of it is unacknowledged. I shall be anxious till I receive your answer to it. I was perfectly satisfied before I received your letter that your opinion had been misunderstood or misrepresented in the case of the Chevalier des Messrs. Your letter, however, will enable me to say so with authority. It is proper it should be known that you had not given the opinion imputed to you, though, as to the main question, it is become useless, Monsieur De Reyneval having assured me that what I had written on that subject had perfectly satisfied the Count de Vergennes and himself, that this case could never come under the treaty. To evince still further the impropriety of taking up subjects gravely on such imperfect information as this court had, I have this moment received a copy of an act of the Georgia Assembly, placing the subjects of France, as to real estates, on the footing of natural citizens, and expressly recognizing the treaty. Would you think anything could be added after this to put this question still further out of doors? A gentleman of Georgia assured me General Oglethorpe did not own a foot of land in the state. I do not know whether there has been any American determination on the question, whether American citizens and British subjects, born before the Revolution, can be aliens to one another. I know there is an opinion of Lord Coke's, in Colvin's case, that if England and Scotland should, in a course of descent, pass to separate kings, those born under the same sovereign during the Union would remain natural subjects and not aliens. Common sense urges some considerations against this. Natural subjects owe allegiance, but we owe none. Aliens are the subject of a foreign power. We are subjects of a foreign power. The king by the treaty acknowledges our independence. How then can we remain natural subjects? The king's power is by the Constitution competent to the making peace, war, and treaties. He had, therefore, authority to relinquish our allegiance by treaty. But if an act of Parliament had been necessary, the Parliament passed an act to confirm the treaty, so that it appears to me that, in this question, fictions of law alone are opposed to sound sense. I'm in hopes Congress will send a minister to Lisbon. I know no country with which we are likely to cultivate a more useful commerce. I have pressed this in my private letters. It is difficult to learn anything certain here about the French and English treaty, yet in general little is expected to be done between them. I'm glad to hear that the delegates of Virginia had made the vote relative to English commerce, though they afterwards repealed it. I hope they will come to again. When my last letters came away, they were engaged in passing the revisal of their laws, with some small alterations. The bearer of this, Mr. Lyons, is a sensible, worthy young physician, son of one of our judges, and on his return to Virginia. Remember me with affection to Mrs. and Miss Adams, Colonels Smith and Humphries, and be assured of the esteem with which I am, dear sir, your friend and servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 157 to James Madison, Paris, February 8th, 1786. Dear Sir, my last letters were of the 1st and 20th of September and the 28th of October. Yours, unacknowledged, are of August the 20th, October the 3rd, and November the 15th. I take this, the first safe opportunity, of enclosing to you the bills of lading for your books, and 2 others for your namesake of Williamsburg, and for the attorney, which I will pray you to forward. I thank you for the communication of the remonstrance against the assessment. Mazier, who is now in Holland, promised me to have it published in the Leyden Gazette. It will do us great honor. I wish it may be as much approved by our Assembly as by the wisest part of Europe. I've heard with great pleasure that our Assembly have come to the resolution of giving the regulation of their commerce to the federal head. I will venture to assert that there is not one of its opposers who, placed on this ground, would not see the wisdom of this measure. The politics of Europe render it indispensably necessary that with respect to everything external, we be one nation only, firmly hooped together. Internal government is what each state should keep to itself. If it were seen in Europe that all our states could be brought to concur in what the Virginia Assembly has done, it would produce a total revolution in their opinion of us and respect for us. And it should ever be held in mind that insult and war are the consequences of a want of respectability in the national character. As long as the states exercise separately those acts of power which respect foreign nations, so long will there continue to be irregularities committed by some one or other of them, which will constantly keep us on an ill footing with foreign nations. I thank you for your information as to my notes. The copies I have remaining shall be sent over, to be given to some of my friends and to select subjects in the college. I have been unfortunate here with this trifle. I gave out a few copies only, and to confidential persons, writing in every copy a restraint against its publication. Among others, I gave a copy to a Mr. Williams. He died. I immediately took every precaution I could to recover this copy, but by some means or other, a bookseller had got hold of it. He employed a hireling translator, and is about publishing it in the most injurious form possible. I am now at a loss what to do as to England. Everything, good or bad, is thought worth publishing there, and I apprehend a translation back from the French and a publication there. I rather believe it will be most eligible to let the original come out in that country, but am not yet decided. I have purchased little for you in the book way since I sent the catalogue of my former purchases. I wish first to have your answer to that, and your information what parts of these purchases went out of your plan. You can easily say, buy more of this kind, less of that, etc. My wish is to conform myself to yours. I can get for you the original Paris edition of the Encyclopedie, in 35 volumes, folio, for 620 livres. A good edition, in 39 volumes, for 380 livres, and a good one, in 39 volumes, 8vo, for 280 livres. The new one will be superior in far the greater number of articles, but not in all. And the possession of the ancient one has, moreover, the advantage of supplying present use. I've bought one for myself, but wait your orders as to you. I remember your purchase of a watch in Philadelphia. If it should not have proved good, you can probably sell it. In that case, I can get for you here one made as perfect as human art can make it, for about 24 louis. I have had such a one made by the best and most faithful hand in Paris. It has a second hand, but no repeating, no day of the month, nor other useless thing to impede and injure the movements which are necessary. For 12 louis more, you can have in the same cover, but on the back, and absolutely unconnected with the movements of the watch, a pedometer, which shall render you an exact account of the distances you walk. Your pleasure hereon shall be awaited. Houdon has returned. He called on me the other day to remonstrate against the inscription proposed for General Washington's statue. He says it is too long to be put on the pedestal. I told him I was not at liberty to permit any alteration, but I would represent his objection to a friend who could judge of its validity and whether a change could be authorized. This has been the subject of conversations here, and various devices and inscriptions have been suggested. The one which has appeared best to me may be translated as follows. Quote, "Behold, reader, the form of George Washington. For his worth, ask history. That will tell it when this stone shall have yielded to the decays of time. His country erects this monument, Houdon makes it." Unquote. This for one side. On the second, represent the evacuation of Boston with the motto Hostibus primum fugatis. On the third, the capture of the Hessians with Hostibus interim divictis. On the fourth, the surrender of York with Hostibus ultimum debilatis. This is seizing the three most brilliant actions of his military life. By giving out here a wish of receiving mottos for this statue, we might have thousands offered, from which still better might be chosen. The artist made the same objection, of length, to the inscription for the bust of the Marquis de Lafayette. An alteration of that might come in time still, if an alteration was wished. However, I'm not certain that is desirable in either case. The state of Georgia has given 20,000 acres of land to the Count d'Estaing. This gift is considered here as very honorable to him, and it has gratified him much. I am persuaded that a gift of lands by the state of Virginia to the Marquis de Lafayette would give a good opinion here of our character, and would reflect honor on the Marquis. Nor am I sure that the day will not come when it might be a useful asylum to him. The time of life at which he visited America was too well adapted to receive good and lasting impressions, to permit him ever to accommodate himself to the principles of monarchical government, and it will need all his own prudence, and that of his friends, to make this country a safe residence for him. How glorious, how comfortable in reflection will it be to have prepared a refuge for him in case of a reverse. In the meantime, he could settle it with tenants from the freest part of this country, Breton. I have never suggested the smallest idea of this kind to him, because the execution of it should convey the first notice. If the state has not a right to give him lands with their own officers, they could buy up at cheap prices the shares of others. I am not certain, however, whether in the public or private opinion a similar gift to Count Rochambeau could be dispensed with. If the state could give to both, it would be better, but in any event, I think they should to the Marquis. Count Rochambeau, too, has really deserved more attention than he has received. Why not set up his bust, that of Gates, Greene, Franklin, in your new capital? Apropos of the capital, do, my dear friend, exert yourself to get this plan begun on, set aside, and that adopted which was drawn here. It was taken from a model which has been the admiration of 16 centuries, which has been the object of as many pilgrimage as the tomb of Mahomet, which will give unrivaled honor to our state, and furnish a model whereon to form the taste of our young men. It will cost much less, too, than the one begun, because it does not cover one half of the area. Ask, if you please, a sight of my letter of January the 26th to Messrs. Buchanan and Hay, which will spare me the repeating its substance here. Everything is quiet in Europe. I recollect but one new invention in the arts which is worth mentioning. It is a mixture of the arts of engraving and printing, rendering both cheaper. Write or draw anything on a plate of brass with the ink of the inventor, and in half an hour he gives you engraved copies of it, so perfectly like the original that they could not be suspected to be copies. His types for printing a whole page are all in one solid piece. An author, therefore, only prints a few copies of his work from time to time as they are called for. This saves the loss of printing more copies than may possibly be sold, and prevents an edition from being ever exhausted. I am, with a lively esteem, dear sir, your sincere friend and servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 158, to the Marquis de Lafayette, Paris, February 9th, 1786. Dear Sir, the Mr. John Ledyard, who proposes to undertake the journey through the northern parts of Asia and America, is a citizen of Connecticut, one of the United States of America. He accompanied Captain Cook in his last voyage to the northwestern parts of America, and rendered himself useful to that officer on some occasions by a spirit of enterprise which has distinguished his whole life. He has genius and education better than the common, and a talent for useful and interesting observation. I believe him to be an honest man and a man of truth. To all this he adds just as much singularity of character, and of that particular kind, too, as was necessary to make him undertake the journey he proposes. Should he get safe through it, I think he will give an interesting account of what he shall have seen. I have the honor to be, with sentiments of sincere esteem and respect, dear sir, your most obedient and most humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 159, to Monsieur Hilliard D'Auberteuil, Paris, February 20th, 1786. Sir, I have been honored with your letter and the books which accompanied it, for which I return you my hearty thanks. America cannot but be flattered with the choice of the subject on which you are at present employing your pen. The memory of the American Revolution will be immortal, and will immortalize those who record it. The reward is encouraging, and will justify all those pains which a rigorous investigation of facts will render necessary. Many important facts which preceded the commencement of hostilities took place in England. These may mostly be obtained from good publications in that country. Some took place in this country. They will be probably hidden from the present age. But America is the field where the greatest mass of important events were transacted, and where alone they can now be collected. I therefore much applaud your idea of going to that country for the verification of the facts you mean to record. Every man there can tell you more than any man here who has not been there, and the very ground itself will give you new insight into some of the most interesting transactions. If I can be of service to you in promoting your object there, I offer myself freely to your use. I shall be flattered by the honor of your visit here at any time. I am seldom from home before noon, but if any later hour should suit you better, I will take care to be at home at any hour and day you will be pleased to indicate. I have the honor to be, with great respect, sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 160, to the Count de Vergennes, Paris, February 28, 1786. Sir, circumstances of public duty calling me suddenly to London, I take the liberty of mentioning it to your Excellency, and of asking a few minutes' audience of you at as early a day and hour as will be convenient to you, and that you will be so good as to indicate them to me. I would wish to leave Paris about Friday or Saturday, and suppose that my stay in London will be of about 3 weeks. I shall be happy to be the bearer of any commands your Excellency may have for that place, and will faithfully execute them. I cannot omit mentioning how pleasing it would be to me to be enabled, before my departure, to convey to the American prisoners at St. Pont de Leon such mitigation of their fate as may be thought admissible. I have the honor to be, with sentiments of the highest respect and esteem, your Excellency's most obedient and most humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. End of section 61. Section 62 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1, by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 161, To Monsieur De Reyneval, Paris, March 3, 1786. Sir, His Excellency Count de Vergennes, having been pleased to say that he would give orders at Calais for the admission of certain articles which I wish to bring with me from England, I have thought it best to give a description of them before my departure. They will be as follows. 1. A set of table furniture consisting of china, silver, and plated ware, distributed into 3 or 4 boxes or canteens for the convenience of removing them. 2. A box containing small tools for wooden and ironwork for my own amusement. 3. A box, probably, of books. 4. I expect to bring with me a riding horse, saddle, etc. The mathematical instruments will probably be so light that I may bring them in my carriage, in which case I presume they will pass with my baggage, under the authority of the passport for my person. If these orders can be made out in time, I would willingly be the bearer of them myself. I have the honor to be, with sentiments of the most perfect esteem and respect, Sir, your most obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 162 to John Jay, London, March 12, 1786. Sir, the date of a letter from London will doubtless be as unexpected to you as it was unforeseen by myself a few days ago. On the 27th of the last month, Colonel Smith arrived in Paris with a letter from Mr. Adams, informing me that there was at this place a minister from Tripoli, having general powers to enter into treaties on behalf of his state, and with whom it was possible we might do something under our commission to that power, and that he gave reason to believe he could also make arrangements with us for Tunis. He further added that the minister of Portugal here had received ultimate instructions from his court, and that probably that treaty might be concluded in the space of 3 weeks, were we all on the spot together. He therefore pressed me to come over immediately. The first of these objects had some weight on my mind, because, as we had sent no person to Tripoli or Tunis, I thought if we could meet a minister from them on this ground, our arrangements would be settled much sooner and at less expense. But what principally decided me was the desire of bringing matters to a conclusion with Portugal before the term of our commissions should expire, or any new turn in the negotiations of France and England should abate their willingness to fix a connection with us. A third motive had also its weight. I hoped that my attendance here, and the necessity of shortening it, might be made use of to force a decisive answer from this court. I therefore concluded to comply with Mr. Adams's request. I went immediately to Versailles, and apprised the Count de Vergennes that circumstances of public duty called me hither for 3 or 4 weeks, arranged with him some matters, and set out with Colonel Smith for this place, where we arrived last night, which was as early as the excessive rigor of the weather admitted. I saw Mr. Adams immediately, and again today. He informs me that the minister of Portugal was taken ill 5 or 6 days ago, has been very much so, but is now somewhat better. It would be very mortifying indeed should this accident, with the shortness of the term to which I limit my stay here, defeat what had been the principal object of my journey, and that without which I should hardly have undertaken it. With respect to this country, I had no doubt but that every consideration had been urged by Mr. Adams, which was proper to be urged. Nothing remains undone in this way. But we shall avail ourselves of my journey here, as if made on purpose, just before the expiration of our commission, to form our report to Congress on the execution of that commission, which report, they may be given to know, cannot be formed without decisive information of the ultimate determination of their court. There is no doubt what that determination will be, but it will be useful to have it, as it may put an end to all further expectations on our side the water, and show that the time has come for doing whatever is to be done by us for counteracting the unjust and greedy designs of this country. We shall have the honor, before I leave this place, to inform you of the result of the several matters which have brought me to it. A day or two before my departure from Paris, I received your letter of January blank. The question therein proposed, how far France considers herself as bound to insist on the delivery of the posts, would infallibly produce another. How far we consider ourselves as guarantees of their American possessions, and bound to enter into any future war in which these may be attacked. The words of the Treaty of Alliance seem to be without ambiguity on either head, yet I should be afraid to commit Congress by answering without authority. I will endeavor on my return to sound the opinion of the minister, if possible, without exposing myself to the other question. Should anything forcible be mediated on these posts, it would possibly be thought prudent previously to ask the good offices of France to obtain their delivery. In this case, they would probably say, we must first execute the treaty on our part by repealing all acts which have contravened it. Now, this measure, if there be any candor in the Court of London, would suffice to obtain a delivery of the posts from them without the mediation of any third power. However, if this mediation should be finally needed, I see no reason to doubt our obtaining it, and still less to question its omnipotent influence on the British court. I have the honor to be, with the highest respect and esteem, Sir, your most obedient and most humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. Letter 163, to Colonel Humphries, London, March 14, 1786. Dear Sir, I have been honored with your letter, in which you mention to me your intention of returning to America in the April packet. It is with sincere concern that I meet this event, as it deprives me not only of your aid in the office in which we have been joined, but also of your society, which has been to me a source of the greatest satisfaction. I think myself bound to return you my thanks for it, and at the same time to bear testimony that in the discharge of the office of Secretary of Legation to the several commissions, you have fulfilled all its duties with readiness, propriety, and fidelity. I sincerely wish that on your return our country may avail itself of your talents in the public service, and that you may be willing so to employ them. You carry with you my wishes for your prosperity, and a desire of being instrumental to it, and I hope that in every situation in which we may be placed, you will freely command and count on my services. I will beg to be favored with your letters whenever it is convenient. You have seen our want of intelligence here, and well know the nature of that which will be useful or agreeable. I fear I shall have little interesting to give you in return, but such news as my situation affords you shall be sure to receive. I pray you to be the bearer of the enclosed letter to Mr. J., to accept my wishes for a favorable passage, a happy meeting with your friends, and for every future felicity which this life can afford, being with the greatest esteem, dear sir, your sincere friend and most humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. End of section 62. Section 63 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1 by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix Note A. To the Governor of Virginia, Kaskaskia, Illinois, April 29, 1779. Dear Sir, a few days ago I received certain intelligence of William Morris, my express to you being killed near the Falls of Ohio. News truly disagreeable to me, as I fear many of my letters will fall into the hands of the enemy at Detroit, although some of them, as I learn, were found in the woods torn to pieces. I do not doubt but before the receipt of his, you will have heard of my late success against Governor Hamilton at Post St. Vincent. That gentleman, with a body of men, possessed himself of that post on the 15th of December last, prepared the fortifications for a repository, and in the spring meant to attack this place, which he made no doubt of carrying, where he was to be joined by 200 Indians from Michilimackinac and 500 Cherokees, Chickasaws, and other nations. With this body, he was to penetrate up the Ohio to Fort Pitt, sweeping Kentucky on his way, having light brass cannon for the purpose, joined on his march by all the Indians that could be got to him. He made no doubt that he could force all West Augusta. This expedition was ordered by the Commander-in-Chief of Canada. Destruction seemed to hover over us from every quarter. Detached parties of the enemy were in the neighborhood every day, but afraid to attack. I ordered Major Bowman to evacuate the fort at the Cohas, and join me immediately, which he did. Having not received a scrape of a pen from you for near 12 months, I could see but little probability of keeping possession of the country, as my number of men was too small to stand a siege, and my situation too remote to call for assistance. I made all the preparations I possibly could for the attack, and was necessitated to set fire to some of the houses in town to clear them out of the way. But, in the height of the hurry, a Spanish merchant who had been at St. Vincent arrived and gave the following intelligence: that Mr. Hamilton had weakened himself by sending his Indians against the frontiers, and to block up the Ohio, that he had not more than 80 men in garrison, 3 pieces of cannon, and some swivels mounted, and that he intended to attack this place as soon as the winter opened, and made no doubt of clearing the western waters by the fall. My situation and circumstances induced me to fall on the resolution of attacking him before he could collect his Indians again. I was sensible the resolution was as desperate as my situation, but I saw no other probability of securing the country. I immediately dispatched a small galley, which I had fitted up, mounting 2 4-pounders and 4 swivels, with a company of men and necessary stores on board, with orders to force her way, if possible, and station herself a few miles below the enemy, suffer nothing to pass her, and wait for further orders. In the meantime, I marched across the country with 130 men, being all I could raise, after leaving this place garrisoned by the militia. The inhabitants of the country behaved exceedingly well. Numbers of young men turned out on the expedition, and every other one embodied to guard the different towns. I marched the 7th of February. Although so small a body, it took me 16 days on the route. The inclemency of the season, high waters, etc., seemed to threaten the loss of the expedition. When within 3 leagues of the enemy, in a direct line, it took us 5 days to cross the drowned lands of the Wabash River, having to wade often upwards of 2 leagues to our breast in water. Had not the weather been warm, we must have perished. But on the evening of the 23rd, we got on dry land, in sight of the enemy, and at 7 o'clock made the attack before they knew anything of us. The town immediately surrendered with joy and assisted in the siege. There was a continual fire on both sides for 18 hours. I had no expectation of gaining the fort until the arrival of my artillery. The moon setting about 1 o'clock, I had an entrenchment thrown up within rifle shot of their strongest battery, and poured such showers of well-directed balls into their ports that we silenced 2 pieces of cannon in 15 minutes without getting a man hurt. Governor Hamilton and myself had, on the following day, several conferences, but did not agree until the evening, when he agreed to surrender the garrison, 79 in number, prisoners of war with considerable stores. I got only 1 man wounded. Not being able to lose many, I made them secure themselves well. 7 were badly wounded in the fort, through the ports. In the height of this action, an Indian party that had been to war and taken 2 prisoners came in, not knowing of us. Hearing of them, I dispatched a party to give them battle in the commons, and got 9 of them with the 2 prisoners, who proved to be Frenchmen. Hearing of a convoy of goods from Detroit, I sent a party of 60 men in armed boats well mounted with swivels to meet them before they could receive any intelligence. They met the convoy 40 leagues up the river and made a prize of the whole, taking 40 prisoners and about 10,000 pounds worth of goods and provisions. Also, the mail from Canada to Governor Hamilton, containing, however, no news of importance. But what crowned the general joy was the arrival of William Morris, my express to you, with your letters, which gave general satisfaction. The soldiery, being made sensible of the gratitude of their country for their services, were so much elated that they would have attempted the reduction of Detroit had I ordered them. Having more prisoners than I knew what to do with, I was obliged to discharge a greater part of them on parole. Mr. Hamilton, his principal officers, and a few soldiers I have sent to Kentucky, under convoy of Captain Williams, in order to be conducted to you. After dispatching Morris with letters to you, treating with the neighboring Indians, etc., I returned to this place, leaving a sufficient garrison at St. Vincent. During my absence, Captain Robert George, who now commands the company formerly commanded by Captain Willing, had returned from New Orleans, which greatly added to our strength. It gave great satisfaction to the inhabitants when acquainted with the protection which was given them, the alliance with France, etc. I am impatient for the arrival of Colonel Montgomery, but have heard nothing of him lately. By your instructions to me, I find you put no confidence in General McIntosh's taking Detroit, as you encourage me to attempt it if possible. It has been twice in my power. Had I been able to raise only 500 men when I first arrived in the country, or when I was at St. Vincent, could I have secured my prisoners and only have had 300 good men, I should have attempted it, and since learned there could have been no doubt of success, as by some gentlemen lately from that post we are informed that the town and country kept 3 days in feasting and diversions on hearing of my success against Mr. Hamilton, and were so certain of my embracing the fair opportunity of possessing myself of that post, that the merchants and others provided many necessaries for us on our arrival, the garrison consisting of only 80 men, not daring to stop their diversions. They are now completing a new fort, and I fear too strong for any force I shall ever be able to raise in this country. We are proud to hear Congress intends putting their forces on the frontiers under your direction. A small army from Pittsburgh, conducted with spirit, may easily take Detroit and put an end to the Indian War. Those Indians who are active against us are the Six Nations, part of the Shawnee, the Menominees, and about half the Chessaways, Ottawas, Jomas, and Poetonymous nations bordering on the lakes. Those nations who have treated with me have behaved since very well, to wit the Piankashas, Kickapoos, Orkanatsab of the Wabash River, the Kaskias, Parians, Michiganis, Foxes, Sacs, Oprays, Illinois, and Poise nations of the Mississippi and Illinois rivers. Part of the Chessaways have also treated and are peaceable. I continually keep agents among them to watch their motions and keep them peaceably inclined. Many of the Cherokees, Chickasaws, and their confederates are, I fear, ill-disposed. It would be well if Colonel Montgomery should give them a dressing as he comes down the Tennessee. There can be no peace expected from many nations while the English are at Detroit. I strongly suspect they will turn their arms against the Illinois, as they will be encouraged. I shall always be on my guard, watching every opportunity to take the advantage of the enemy, and if I am ever able to muster 600 or 700 men, I shall give them a shorter distance to come and fight me than at this place. There is one circumstance very distressing, that of our moneys being discredited, to all intents and purposes, by the great number of traders who come here in my absence, each outbidding the other, giving prices unknown in this country by 500%. by which the people conceived it to be of no value, and both French and Spaniards refused to take a farthing of it. Provision is 3 times the price it was 2 months past, and to be got by no other means than my own bonds, goods, or force. Several merchants are now advancing considerable sums of their own property, rather than the service should suffer, by which I am sensible they must lose greatly, unless some method is taken to raise the credit of our coin, or a fund be sent to Orleans for the payment of the expenses of this place, which would at once reduce the price of every species of provision, money being of little service to them, unless it would pass at the ports they trade at. I mentioned to you my drawing some bills on Mr. Pollock in New Orleans, as I had no money with me. He would accept the bills, but had not money to pay them off, though the sums were trifling, so that we have little credit to expect from that quarter. I shall take every step I possibly can for laying up a sufficient quantity of provisions, and hope you will immediately send me an express with your instructions. Public expenses in this country have hitherto been very low, and may still continue so, if a correspondence is fixed at New Orleans for payment of expenses in this country, or gold and silver sent. I'm glad to hear of Colonel Todd's appointment. I think government has taken the only step they could have done to make this country flourish and be of service to them. No other regulation would have suited the people. The last account I had of Colonel Rogers was his being in New Orleans with 6 of his men. The rest he left at the Spanish Ozark, above the Natchez. I shall immediately send him some provisions, as I learn he is in great want. I doubt he will not be able to get his goods up the river, except in Spanish bottoms. One regiment would be able to clear the Mississippi, and do great damage to the British interest in Florida, and by properly conducting themselves might perhaps gain the affection of the people, so as to raise a sufficient force to give a shock to Pensacola. Our alliance with France has entirely devoted this people to our interest. I have sent several copies of the articles to Detroit, and do not doubt but they will produce the desired effect. Your instructions I shall pay implicit regard to, and hope to conduct myself in such a manner as to do honor to my country. I am, with the greatest respect, your humble servant, G.R. Clarke. P.S. I understand there is a considerable quantity of cannon ball at Pittsburgh. We are much in want of 4 and 6 pound ball. I hope you will immediately order some down. In Council, June 18, 1779. The board proceeded to the consideration of the letters of Colonel Clarke and other papers relating to Henry Hamilton, Esquire, who has acted for some years past as Lieutenant Governor of the settlement at and about Detroit, and Commandant of the British garrison there, under Sir Guy Carleton as Governor-in-Chief, Philip de Jean, Justice of the Peace for Detroit, and William Nalmonth, Captain of Volunteers, prisoners of war, taken in the county of Illinois. They find that Governor Hamilton has executed the task of inciting the Indians to perpetrate their accustomed cruelties on the citizens of the United States, without distinction of age, sex, or condition, with an eagerness and avidity which evince that the general nature of his charge harmonized with his particular disposition. They should have been satisfied from the other testimony adduced that these enormities were committed by savages acting under his commission, but the number of proclamations which at different times were left in houses, the inhabitants of which were killed or carried away by the Indians, one of which proclamations is in the possession of the board, under the hand and seal of Governor Hamilton, puts this fact beyond a doubt. At the time of his captivity, it appears he had sent considerable bodies of Indians against the frontier settlements of these states, and had actually appointed a great council of Indians to meet him at Tennessee, to concert the operations of this present campaign. They find that his treatment of our citizens and soldiers, taken and carried within the limits of his command, has been cruel and inhuman, that in the case of John Dodge, a citizen of these states, which has been particularly stated to this board, he loaded him with irons, threw him into a dungeon without bedding, without straw, without fire, in the dead of winter and severe climate of Detroit, that in that state he wasted him with incessant expectations of death, that when the rigors of his situation had brought him so low that death seemed likely to withdraw him from their power, he was taken out and somewhat attended to, till a little mended, and before he had recovered ability to walk, was again returned to his dungeon, in which a hole was cut 7 inches square only for the admission of air, and the same load of irons again put on him, that appearing a second time in imminent danger of being lost to them, he was again taken from his dungeon, in which he had lain from January till June, with the intermission of a few weeks only before mentioned, that Governor Hamilton gave standing rewards for scalps, but offered none for prisoners, which induced the Indians, after making their captives carry their baggage into the neighborhood of the fort, there to put them to death, and carry in their scalps to the governor, who welcomed their return and success by a discharge of cannon, that when a prisoner brought alive and destined to death by the Indians, the fire already kindled, and himself bound to the stake, was dexterously withdrawn and secreted from them by the humanity of a fellow prisoner, a large reward was offered for the discovery of the victim, which, having tempted a servant to betray his concealment, the present prisoner Dijon, being sent with a party of soldiers, surrounded the house, took and threw into jail the unhappy victim and his deliverer, where the former soon expired under the perpetual assurances of Dijon that he was to be again restored into the hands of the savages, and the latter, when enlarged, was bitterly reprimanded by Governor Hamilton. It appears to them that the prisoner Dijon was on all occasions the willing and cordial instrument of Governor Hamilton, acting both as judge and keeper of the jails, and instigating and urging him, by malicious insinuations and untruths, to increase rather than relax his severities, heightening the cruelty of his orders by his manner of executing them, offering at one time a reward to one man to be hangman for another, threatening his life on refusal, and taking from his prisoners the little property their opportunities enabled them to acquire. It appears that the prisoner Lamothe was a captain of the volunteer scalping parties of Indians and whites, who went from time to time under general orders to spare neither men, women, nor children. From this detail of circumstances, which arose in a few cases only, coming accidentally to the knowledge of the board, they think themselves authorized by fair deduction to presume what would be the horrid history of the sufferings of the many, who have expired under their miseries, which therefore will remain forever untold, or who have escaped from them and are yet too remote and too much dispersed to bring together their well-founded accusations against the prisoners. They have seen that the conduct of the British officers, civil and military, has in the whole course of this war been savage and unprecedented among civilized nations, that our officers taken by them have been confined in crowded jails, loathsome dungeons and prison ships, loaded with irons, supplied often with no food, generally with too little for the sustenance of nature, and that little sometimes unsound and unwholesome, whereby such numbers have perished that captivity and death have with them been almost synonymous, that they have been transported beyond seas where their fate is out of the reach of our inquiry, have been compelled to take arms against their country, and, by a refinement in cruelty, to become murderers of their own brethren. Their prisoners with us have, on the other hand, been treated with humanity and moderation. They have been fed on all occasions with wholesome and plentiful food, suffered to go at large within extensive tracts of country, treated with liberal hospitality, permitted to live in the families of our citizens, to labor for themselves, to acquire and enjoy profits, and finally to participate of the principal benefits of society, privileged from all burdens. Reviewing this contrast, which cannot be denied by our enemies themselves in a single point, and which has now been kept up during 4 years of unremitting war, a term long enough to produce well-founded despair that our moderation may ever lead them to the practice of humanity, called on by that justice we owe to those who are fighting the battles of our country to deal out, at length, miseries to their enemies, measure for measure, and to distress the feelings of mankind by exhibiting to them spectacles of severe retaliation, where we had long and vainly endeavored to introduce an emulation in kindness, happily possessed by the fortune of war of some of those very individuals who, having distinguished themselves personally in this line of cruel conduct, are fit subjects to begin on with the work of retaliation. This board has resolved to advise the governor that the said Henry Hamilton, Philip de Vergennes, and William Lamothe, prisoners of war, be put into irons, confined in the dungeon of the public jail, disbarred the use of pen, ink, and paper, and excluded all converse except with their keeper, and the governor orders accordingly. Signed, Archibald Blair, C.C. End of Note A, end of Section 63. Section 64 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1 by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix Note B. In Council, September 29, 1779. The board having been at no time unmindful of the circumstances attending the confinement of Lieutenant Governor Hamilton, Captain Lamothe, and Philip de Vergennes, which the personal cruelties of those men, as well as the general conduct of the enemy, had constrained them to advise, wishing and willing to expect that their sufferings may lead them to the practice of humanity, should any future turn of fortune in their favor submit to their discretion the fate of their fellow creatures, that it may prove an admonition to others, meditating like cruelties, not to rely for impunity in any circumstances of distance or present security, and that it may induce the enemy to reflect what must be the painful consequences should a continuation of the same conduct on their part impel us again to severities, while such multiplied subjects of retaliation are within our power, sensible that no impression can be made on the event of the war by wreaking vengeance on miserable captives, that the great cause which has animated the two nations against each other is not to be decided by unmanly cruelties on wretches who have bowed their necks to the power of the victor, but by the exercise of honorable valor in the field, earnestly hoping that the enemy, viewing the subject in the same light, will be content to abide the event of that mode of decision, and spare us the pain of a second departure from kindness to our captives, confident that commiseration to our prisoners is the only possible motive to which can be candidly ascribed, in the present actual circumstances of the war, the advice we are now about to give. The board does advise the governor to send Lieutenant Governor Hamilton, Captain Lamothe, and Philip de Vergennes to Hanover Courthouse, there to remain at large, within certain reasonable limits, taking their parole in the usual manner. The governor orders accordingly. Archibald Blair, C.C. Ordered that Major John Hay be sent also, under parole, to the same place. Signed, Archibald Blair, C.C. End of Section 64. Section 65 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1 by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix Note C. In Council, October 8, 1779. The Governor is advised to take proper and effectual measures for knowing from time to time the situation and treatment of our prisoners by the enemy, and to extend to theirs, with us, a like treatment in every circumstance, and also to order to a proper station the prison ship fitted up on recommendations from Congress for the reception and confinement of such prisoners of war as shall be sent to it. Signed, Archibald Blair, C.C. End of Section 65, end of Note C. Section 66 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1 by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix Note D. After Letter 17 in the manuscript is inserted the following memorandum. Female contributions in aid of the war, probably in 1780. Mrs. Sarah Carey of Scotchtown, a watch chain cost £7 sterling. Mrs. Ambler, 5 gold rings. Mrs. Rebecca Ambler, 3 gold rings. Mrs. Nicholas, a diamond drop. Mrs. Griffin of Dover, 10 half-joes. Mrs. Gilmer, 5 guineas. Mrs. Ann Ramsay, for Fairfax, 1 half-joe, 3 guineas, 3 pistareens, 1 bit. Doe for doe paper money, bundle number 1, $20,000. Number 2, $27,000. Number 3, $15,000. Number 4, $13,518 and 1/3. Mrs. Lewis, for Albemarle, £1,559, 8 shillings paper money. Mrs. Weldon, £39, 18 shillings new, instead of £1,600 old paper money. Mrs. Blackburn, for Prince William, $7,506 paper money. Mrs. Randolph, the younger, of Chatsworth, $800. Mrs. Fitzhugh and others, £558. End of Section 66 and Appendix Note D. Section 67 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1 by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix Note E. Lord Cornwallis's letter to Lieutenant Colonel Nisbet Balfour, Commander at 96. I have the happiness to inform you that on Wednesday, the 16th instant, I totally defeated General Gates's army. 1,000 were killed and wounded, about 800 taken prisoners. We are in possession of 8 pieces of brass cannon, all they had in the field, all their ammunition wagons, a great number of arms, and 130 baggage wagons. In short, there never was a more complete victory. I have written to Lieutenant Colonel Turnbull, whom I sent to join Major Johnson on Little River, to push on after General Sumter to the Waxhaws, whose detachment is the only collected force of rebels in all this country. Colonel Tarleton is in pursuit of Sumter. Our loss is about 300 killed and wounded, chiefly of the 33rd Regiment and Volunteers of Ireland. I have given orders that all the inhabitants of this province, who have subscribed and taken part in this revolt, should be punished with the greatest rigor. Also that those who will not turn out may be imprisoned and their whole property taken from them and destroyed. I have also ordered that satisfaction should be made for their estates to those who have been injured and oppressed by them. I have ordered in the most positive manner that every militiaman who has borne arms with us and afterwards joined the enemy shall be immediately hanged. I desire you will take the most rigorous measures to punish the rebels in the district in which you command, and that you will obey in the strictest manner the directions I have given in this letter relative to the inhabitants of this country. Signed, Cornwallis, August 1780. End of Note E, end of Section 67. Section 68 of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1 by Thomas Jefferson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix Note F. To Lord Cornwallis, Portsmouth, Virginia, November 4th, 1780. My Lord, I've been here near a week establishing a post. I wrote to you to Charleston and by another messenger by hand. I cannot hear for a certainty where you are. I await your orders. The bearer is to be handsomely rewarded if he brings me any note or mark from your lordship. Signed, A.L. End of Appendix Note F, Section 68, and end of Memoir, Correspondence and Miscellanies from the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Volume 1, by Thomas Jefferson.